Welcome everyone to this INCF and OCNS Software Working Group developer session. The idea of these sessions is for developers of different tools in neuroscience to talk to us how they go about developing their tools. And the idea is that we all get to share our knowledge and hopefully improve our tools and get more contributors to all of these tools that we rely on. Today we have Richard Gherkin, who's the primary developer of the development lead for SciDash and pretty much the complete SciUnit ecosystem. And they'll talk to us about SciUnit, Neuron Unit, and everything else there is. Richard, all yours.
Thanks for inviting me. And if you're interested in more about SciUnit that's not from the developer perspective, maybe from the user perspective, I believe Shailesh is going to be giving a talk on July 6th at CNS. So Shailesh can give you those details. Okay, so SciUnit arose out of the need for basically for figuring out whether to start with my models, but then other people's models were doing what they claimed to be doing and how well. And it also arises out of the need for test-driven development in modeling in general. So when you're building your model, you don't necessarily just want to know at the very end whether or not it matches, the data collected, experimental data collected from the system you're trying to model, but you'd like to ideally know during development so you can guide the parts of your model that are, unconstrained towards the goal of matching the system that you're trying to model. So there are certainly tools available other than SciUnit for doing unit testing in general, right? You could just use a Python or any other tools unit testing framework to do unit tests, but I see those unit tests as being focused on does a particular piece of code do what it says, right? Does it satisfy the guarantees that it makes in the documentation and the developer's intentions? Whereas SciUnit is asking whether a model produces an output that it says that you want it to produce. Also, there are things kind of like this just in the machine learning ecosystem, but they don't necessarily play nice with the kinds of models that many people in biology or neuroscience do that involve dynamical systems, and especially like some large and complex tool chains for doing like neural simulations and things like that. So the goal of SciUnit is that it's going to be something that you can wrap around your models and expose the parts of the model that you want to ever be tested to a common interface, so that a test that you or someone else writes for that model to take doesn't actually have to know how the model is implemented. It just needs to know what calls it needs to make in order to have those calls happen. So, for example, it doesn't matter what simulator you use. It doesn't matter whether you represent member potential one way or another. It may not even matter if you have a member potential in your model. Just whatever your model can do, you want to expose those things. So from the developer perspective, one of the key goals here is to separate interface from implementation. So I'm gonna go through it. I'm gonna dive into rather than the tutorials that I normally do. I'm gonna just dive right into the code and show you what that looks like. So on the main website. On the main SciDash website, which is the overarching website for this project, there are a few tools described, but if you want to jump right into SciUnit, links to here, just gives you some basic things here, and then there are tutorials for those who are interested. I happen to recently have enjoyed using Jupyter Book as my way of just deploying my tutorials. It's if you're someone who likes to develop or work in Jupyter notebooks, it's a really nice way to package things up. So this is basically just a series of tutorial notebooks that I've written, and if you click on, it's really almost a one-line deployment. You click on one, and it will go there, and it will show you the notebook sort of as HTML, and then if you click some of these buttons, you can actually launch Colab or launch Binder instances to run those in the cloud, or people can simply clone them and run them themselves. Getting back to the code for a minute. The code is here, and I'm gonna, I think, dive right into the main idea behind SciUnit that drives like everything I think about in terms of development and in terms of thinking about developing libraries that build upon SciUnit. And is called the capability. So inside SciUnit, I have things organized with a base class, some base classes that much of SciUnit derives from, which I can go into later. But the capabilities file here is sort of a key and important idea. So the capability class is an abstract based class for capabilities. A capability is something that is something a model can do, and something a model says tells a test what you have to call to make it do that thing. So a capability might be that a model can produce a memory potential trace. And if that's the case, then the model might have a capability called produces memory potential, and it might have various methods that can be called by a test to extract or to produce that memory potential in the first place, which might in turn rely on other capabilities and so on. It can be very, very nested. But the important thing is that the test never has to rely on knowing something about Neuron or something about Brian or something about any tool you're using to get a memory potential, to get any feature or artifact of the model. It simply requires that it has a certain capability implemented. How the model implements it is up to the modeler. So in this capability class, it's a class that a model can inherit from. So just to give you an example of a capability that might be down here. Here's a really, I'll zoom in on this. Here's a really stupid and demonstration capability, produces number, right? So you can have a capability called produces number that says, okay, this model can produce a number. And the thing the test would do, by expressing that capability, then a test, when it's judging a model or it's evaluating a model, would be allowed to make these method calls, any method calls that are part of this capability, of which there's only one called produce number. And that is left unimplemented. Why is that left unimplemented? Because it's up to the modeler to decide how that number would be produced. It could be produce a random number. It could be anything you want from the model. So when a model is actually created or a new model class is created, it would inherit this as a subclass. This produces number, and then would implement produce number. So rather than being left unimplemented, it would actually have some implementation here, like return, numpy.random.rand or something like that, or whatever the number. Maybe the number comes from some real process, right, to return that. And there's some other really generic capabilities that are really common in our use cases, like to be able to run the model. This may seem like a really obvious thing, like shouldn't all models be runnable, but not necessarily, right? Some models are like it's like a structural model. There's nothing to simulate. There's nothing to integrate to get an output. There's just parameters, right? And you can do computations on those. But runnable means that there's something that you actually execute in order to get output, and that's a really common use case in a lot of biological systems. So that's there as well. So what that looks like when you actually are doing this in a use case, let's say I have this runnable class here. It's going to subclass the base class for SciUnit model, and this runnable capability that we were just looking at to make something called runnable model, which again could be a base class for many other kinds of models. It's going to have various abilities that it inherits from this capability, and also from the base SciUnit model class. So you might have a model that says that's something about maybe running a model in NetPine, which is something we're working on now, that inherits from this base class runnable model, and then expresses all sorts of capabilities related to network functions of some network that you built. And so maybe at this point, I just stop for a minute and just take any questions about that. It's a concept of a capability. I think it's really important to have this separation of the interface and implementation when we're thinking about putting our tools together and putting modeling tools and like model evaluation tools or tools oriented around data, because basically it's really not reasonable that every client or every user of the software that we generate has implemented a model in the same way, or that any of the tools we build can know how models have been implemented in advance, right? There's an infinite number of ways that someone could write an implementation of a model. And so we build tools to support models in general, that they need to have this sort of abstract interface there. Okay. So another sort of I think nice thing about this is the ability to implement caching. So there's actually very like a surprisingly small amount of caching, I think, in like modeling tools that I've seen, especially in neuroscience. So one of the things I implemented, I think is important is this backends class. So there's a backend could be anything you use to run a model, right? It could be like a simulator, like a neuron, or it could be something that does symbolic manipulations of algebra in the model, or it could be something you could hand write a Ford Euler implementation of integrating ODs. Whatever all those things are possible backends that could support a model from a set of equations, right? You could do analytical work on them to solve them. You could simulate them. You could simulate them with like existing tools. Those are all ways that, even given the equations describing a model, they could be done, right? So SciUnit has no opinion about what the backend is. We've developed some backends for certain kinds of simulators, especially I think they're strongest for JNeuroML as a reference simulator, because basically you can sort of the class of things that JNeuroML can do is very like clearly circumscribed. It's like NeuroML, and it's a certain class of normal models that it can do, right? Like it doesn't do like multi-compartmental models, for example, but it does lots of other things. And then this backend class, this backend is something you pass to a model when you're instantiating an instance of the model. So model class might be a model class for a certain kind of network model, or a certain model describing a certain kind of system. But the particular instance of the model that you create when you call the model constructor is something you might want to pass a backend to, like that neuron is your backend, or JNeuroML, or Brian, or Pine, or whatever. And in this backend class, there's some sort of that nice caching that goes on. So you can cache like model results to memory, or you can cache them to disk. And why do you want to do so much caching? Or why are you running these things so many times to need this caching? Well, every time you call a capability, it's going to check to see if it has the information it needs to deliver on that capability. So for example, if you ask for like a simulated memory potential trace under a certain condition, it has to know whether that has actually been simulated yet. And that might have been simulated as part of some other test. It might have been simulated as part of satisfying some other capability. So for example, imagine you have a test that's going to run, an FI, it's going to build an FI curve. It's going to build like, for all these different currents, it's going to compute, firing rates of cells. And then later you have another test that computes, the real base current, or computes the interspike interval coefficient of variation, or whatever. It might have already done some of the same simulations as part of testing earlier in the test suite. So some of these simulations might have already been run. And if they're cached, then we can simply look up the results instead of running them again, and actually save a tremendous amount of time. And I think we sometimes, when simulation is cheap, we don't bother to put these things in. But as simulations, scale, having these kinds of caching can be really important. So you can cache into memory, you can cache onto disk, and this has to be done sort of carefully, because how the cache works, there's like a cache key that's describing like what was the state of the model at the time it was run. It has to know not only what was the state of the model, it has to know any like runtime parameters that you gave to it as part of the simulation. So you have to be very careful to make sure that, like, if you said, I would like to inject 25 picograms into this cell, that it knows that that's different from not doing that, right? That's a different simulation. Or if you say, I would like to simulate with this time step, that's different from simulating with another time step. And also there's different from simulating with another simulator, right? So if you simulate something with Neuron and you simulate something with Brian, those are, even though in principle they might produce basically the same output, in practice we know that they don't always. So the cache is going to store all this information about the state of the model at the time of the simulation, run that, and then use these kinds of methods internally to find out whether that's been run before. Most of these are things you never actually call. Most of these are things that simply check the cache here in this backend run method to basically check to see if there is a memory cache here, and if they're in this memory cache, that key has been found, right? So it's going to check and see what the hash of the model is, and then it's going to check and see if that key is in the cache, or if there's a disk cache, if it's there. And if it is there, it's going to return the results. And if it's not, it's going to actually do a run here. And this run is again, this part is all generic, infrastructure for modeling, right? Nothing of this is specific to implementation. But this thing has to actually happen if the simulation does have to occur. It does not exist in the cache. That, of course, could be anything, right? It could be any simulator, it could be anything at all, right? So that's by default not implemented. It's something you have to implement. yourself in a backend. So the backends that we've written, we have this something that is equivalent of calling, you know, the run or the simulate command of various kinds of simulators, and storing results of those outputs from those simulations. So I think that's another kind of key concept in that's I find useful in SciUnit, especially when we're running large sorts of test suites, to make sure that things don't get run again and again and again, that even though they're exactly the same output. Any questions about that so far? Yeah, close my door, hold on. Okay, so in terms of like tools that I also usually think about this here. I've never given a specific developer talk before. Oh, validators. So when you write a SciUnit test and then you say, okay, I would like to have a model that has these parameters, or I'd like to have a test that's parameterized by a certain experimental observation, right? So every test, for those who aren't familiar with this, every test takes mandatory an observation, which could be almost any data type. This is some type hints here for a base class, but in many implementations, it's actually a dictionary, not these types. That observation is the thing you're going to use to test the model against, basically. So observation could be that I have the following, memory potential trace, or I have the following average value for the memory potential, or I have the following, spike field coherence in a network, or whatever. That's the thing that you're passing in. It's usually like oftentimes not as useful to have like an exact output of some experiment, but some stylized fact derived from that output, like an experimental summary. And but certain tests require the observation to have a certain format and have certain parameters and certain units, for example, right? So if you have a test about membrane potential, the units ought to be in some sort of voltage units, right? They can't be in Kelvin or something. And so we have these validators, and I think this is a really good use of this library called Cerberus, which is a generic library for doing for validating schemas, like JSON schemas especially, but really you can validate any like nested dictionary, for example, in Python. So what these validators do is they check to see you write these validator classes. This is a base class from something called Cerberus here. So from Cerberus import validator, and you can register different types of objects, right? So you can make sure that like if you have an object in like Neo or whatever that's something you want to make sure an object is of that type, you can register types to make sure that things that you can write a schema for your observations or for your parameters that uses these types in them. And so one of the things you can do, for example, is validate units. So for example, if I want to validate that something has a particular type of units, I'm able to, as a result of a method like this, I'm able to write schema that says the units for this have to be units of seconds. And if I say that, then it can use then the schema, then someone can pass in units of seconds, or they can pass in milliseconds or microseconds or anything that's equivalent to that, and it will do the conversions. And so it's going to check first if it's part of this an instance of this quantities library. So we use quantities. I think Andrew is and some, actually a few of you are involved in the development of that library. It will check to make sure that it's this quantities object, like 5 times quantity milliseconds, and if not, it's going to tell you that it's going to erase an error in the observation that says, hey, this test needs units of milliseconds for this. You give it units of Kelvin. What are you doing? And it'll make sure that happens before someone does something crazy. But also, more importantly, and maybe more common cases, someone passes in units of milliseconds. The test is going to think about things in seconds. It will make sure the tests get converted to those units, so that you don't have a test where that's off by a factor of 1,000 or something like that. And you do the same thing for parameters as well. Parameters of this is in this case parameters of the run of the test. So not the observation used to constrain the model in the test, but actually the test is going to say, okay, model, inject this amount of current into this cell, or run for this amount of time, or run whatever the parameters of that test are that are not inherent to the test class. Those might have units as well, right? So you might say, I want to run it for 5 seconds, or I want to inject current for 500 milliseconds, or I want to inject 100 picoamps of current, or whatever, into a cell. Those are all checked as well. So I think that's like a really this kind of validation. What it looks like in practice, I've shown you the code for how you actually do the write these validators, but how it actually looks in practice is that you'll have, for example, like checking out neuron unit. Let's see here. Right, so here's a schema, right? Here's a schema that these schemas here that I can drive them. So for example, a schema that says, okay, here's a schema name. The observation for this kind of test that I'm looking at here needs to have these keys. It needs to have a mean, a standard deviation, and a count of data. And they need to have units. So just any quantities units. The subclasses of this will define specific units. We'll say it's in millivolts or whatever. And certain things have to be at minimum, maximum values, perhaps. Or you can have alternative schemas. We could say the user can pass in data that's mean standard deviation n, or I can pass in mean standard error in n. And as long as they have the right keys, it'll allow any of those to interconvert between them. So it gives the user some flexibility in which one they use. That you can have a parameter schema as well. So for example, here's for something we inject current into a cell. Here are some generic parameters, right? So it has to have all of these parameters that someone will have to provide if they want to define a test. Because you don't provide these parameters. I mean, there are default parameters here, but if someone wants to provide new ones, they want to say the amplitude is, 2 nanoamps. So they'll make sure that gets converted into picoamps for the test. If they want to say the amplitude is 2 Kelvin, it'll say that's not valid. And so this used to all be done procedurally through code, where it'd say, okay, check if this unit is this. If it is, do the following thing. But making these kind of schemas that is actually much more flexible. So I can, anytime I want to add a new key, or I want to change something about the key that's done, just sort of in this like nested dictionary, JSON-like style of writing things. I think it's nice when we can write down like our not just our documentation, but our requirements for something in a descriptive way, not a procedural way, because I think it makes it easier to support by tools that make these like descriptive to procedural conversions, but it's also easier for users and developers to read like what's required here. Like if you see this, it's not that hard to tell like what it is you're supposed to provide, right? Like, okay, Tmax is gonna be a time, has to be at least 0. You don't actually need to put it in, right? That's what that says, right? If this is done procedurally and it had all these like if and else statements in there, it'd be harder to tell what was going on. And so I think that's a difference of philosophy, right? It's like, okay, like Pine is a very procedural language, and NetPine is in between, and they're also very descriptive, right? And like people can disagree about like what's easier to read. For this kind of application of like saying, hey user, do this is what's required, and let's check to make sure that was actually done. I think this is a very sort of helpful way to do it. Okay, Shailesh, tell me in terms of and Ankur, in terms of like the level that I'm at, am I targeting the right level here right now, or need to be like higher level, lower level? I'm good. Okay.
I think we are going well. Yeah.
Okay, good. Go back to SciUnit for a minute. Any questions so far? Okay.
Rick, just because I've been dealing with NeuroML quite a bit, is Cerebrus with JSON nicer than all the XML that NeuroML goes through for its schema and its validation?
I think it makes more sense. I mean, personally, I just don't like to read XML. I mean, I don't want to read JSON either, really. But at least it's like there's just less cruft to deal with, right? Like I can, if I want to dump something out that's reasonably large, and I have something that formats it nicely, I feel like I can get to where I need to more easily, and it's a little bit easier to not just to parse, like in the same way, because I can parse it basically like a dictionary, like a nested dictionary in Python. But I can also insert things into it a little more easily. I mean, you know, LXML or whatever, you know, Python tool you use for dealing with XML, but I just don't like it. I mean, you know, that's a preference. So I prefer JSON. I kind of feel like the world prefers JSON. I mean, I feel like more things have been JSONified over time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, NeuroML, I think, is stuck with XML for the time being.
Yeah. Well, what about? I mean, is NeuroML like some JSON capability? JSON thing going on, right?
Yeah, I don't think we worked on anything. I think NeuroML Lite is now moving more towards JSON, but the core NeuroML bits are all XML.
Yeah, that'll be normal forever. I mean, that was just. I think it's fine. I think it's a richer, more way to express things. There are certain things you might need that might be that may be a better case for. But if I just want to say, this thing has like these two properties, or this thing has like these two requirements, and I just like it. I prefer JSON for that. But that's me. Serverless also seems fast and it's easy to extend.
We have a question from Marcel in the chat.
Yeah.
How does the framework and, for example, the caching deal with stochastic simulations?
Oh, okay. So yeah. So that's a good question. And basically, right now, if you have hidden stochasticity that's not expressed in your so first of all, you can always turn the caching on and off in the backend, right? The backend has this attribute that you can use the cache or not. So you don't just turn off the cache. If you don't have a variable that auto increments or that expresses the current state of the random number generator, if you don't have that in there, it won't know that your simulation is stochastic at all, and it'll assume that it's deterministic. And so you'd actually have to say use memory cache equals false to turn it off, because the disk cache is off by default. The memory cache is on by default. So you have to say use memory cache equals false, or you have to simply add an attribute that like auto increments or is at any given time the state of the random number generator or something, so that it knows that no, this is in fact new. And which actually that having that, you know, if you run so many simulations, you actually get back to the same random number generator state at some point, so it will be the same output as a previous simulation. Then at least you have that cached as well. So that might be a little way to go. Okay. So one thing I've been working on recently, and it's actually not in the current, despite this X here, it actually is passing on Travis right now, but well, here, I'll just jump to Travis really quick. I assume basically everyone here knows this, but you know, we had been using Travis all entirely to have to run our unit tests, and so we have you know, this our unit tests running on Travis CI, which used to be travisci.org, and as a week ago, nothing runs at travisci.org anymore. It's all on travisci.com, and I think it won't take that much testing to actually blow through your free tier of credits that you have, and maybe all of you guys have figured this out already. But now that GitHub Actions is like working, at least I think it's working on another project I'm on. I think I could probably move everything off Travis CI into GitHub Actions, but if anyone has any like opinions about that, I'd love to, or Circle CI or whatever, some other thing. But the way I run my Travis, had run my Travis workflow is I install everything from Conda. I kind of hate Python packaging, like everyone does. I think it's just like it just should be so much better than it is, right? I mean, they're always like promising that there'll be a solution, but then they take away the features that you need to make your solution work, like periodically in pip. It's just like something doesn't support it anymore. So I like to have a Conda based environment. I think like it's controversial, but for me, I do as much data science work and maybe more than I do development work. As a data scientist, having like a zillion really complex tools that are not all Python tools, that are like often like compiled from C or whatever, all like are pretty much guaranteed to work like and be friendly with each other at any given time is like super important to me. And it's, I think, also faster to Conda install a whole bunch of complex things as the pip installer when pip sometimes needs to build from source or whatever. So I always just download Miniconda when I'm doing my my testing, and also like in my actual environments. Like I always run all Conda environments all the time. And so in my Travis file, like I have it basically download Conda, install all the really basic stuff, and then it runs, it installs coverall, so I can check for code coverage, and then I need to run one test script, and that test script is this. And everyone's test script looks a little bit different. You can just ignore this part right here. But this is call coveralls basically, or coverage, which is like the Python package for coveralls, and run my unit test and compute code coverage. At which point that code coverage gets uploaded to coveralls.io, and I have my code coverage. But also I like this little buffer trick if you haven't used this before. When you call coverage with buffer, or when you call I think when you call the unit test module with buffer, instead of printing out all your outputs of all your tests, it will only print out outputs for tests that fail. So instead of getting like a wall of text, you just get pass or dot, and then when something fails, then it'll print out what happened. And so you can see, like, if you have some error in one of your tests or some failure, but everything else passes, you don't have to be afraid that it's logging a ton of other information, because you can always turn that off if you want, but really you just care about the tests that fail for the most part. So it's nice to have this buffer thing. Well, it works in the command line, it works from Travis, and it works in other environments you might want to test it in. So as you said, a nice trick. But then that gives you your code coverage, which is pretty good for SciUnit. 87%. I think we're missing a few newer things, but this says where we're missing. So right now, where are we? We're bad in here. We're bad in here, and I think we're bad in here. And actually, part of it might be the I wonder if part of it is the tests that or the classes that Shaylis has contributed, or possibly there are new methods from classes that I've contributed that are under tested. But I kind of know where the weaknesses are right now in my code coverage. But close to 90% I think is strong. NeuronUnit, on the other hand, is not so good. I know, like, for some of you guys, like if I want to submit something to Quantities or to Neo, like it always has to come with a unit test for any contributor, right? That wants to, which is, I think, is a great. Originally, when I was first starting, it was like an annoyance, but now it's like really appreciated, right? They would have that. So, and I still use just Python, like the basic unit test module. I don't use nodes or any of these fancier modules. I don't have that in any form. I'm also like, it's kind of confusing in here because SciUnit is like model validation tests, but then I'm also running unit tests within that. So there's a sort of confusion about, like a semantic confusion about tests. But so I just call them unit tests to make that easier. Okay, what else? I have let's see, just little things. I know these things are so important. A bunch of things in utilities. Here's a class I made, which I think is possibly obsolete, but I want to pick you guys' brains too, if you guys know. I have a bunch of just helpful functions here, but one of them is this. So I made this class. This really doesn't belong in SciUnit. It belongs like in its own package. But notebook tools. This is a class for doing things, especially involving testing with notebooks. That allows me to do a lot of things that are otherwise tricky. Like let's say you have magic commands in your notebook, but you want to execute that notebook in a preprocessor, or you want to convert to Python code. Things that aren't always handled by conversion like that. Or let's say you want to decide whether you want to run a notebook directly, or do you want to convert to a Python file before you run it. Like those are things that can give different outcomes. It can depend on the environment. And I have this sort of extensive class for handling like, what if you have graphics in the notebook, right? And the graphics require a certain graphics backend. Like if you've ever had the problems in Matplotlib where like Matplotlib is telling you that you have a certain backend that's been declared, and now that backend doesn't work because you're on a server versus a desktop. Just a bunch of little things. I suspect that maybe like half of this has been solved since then by like the NB, like the Jupyter ecosystem just evolving. But a lot of this is like is so useful. I can do like code substitutions. If you've ever seen Papermill is a library that does like automatic execution notebooks where you can say like, okay, here's one notebook and you have some template variables, and I want to run this notebook for all values of this template. So like maybe it's a notebook that's just going to run for like like a bunch of different values of some parameter, or you want to run a notebook that analyzes like COVID data, and you want to run every country, right? You have that data for every country, so you want one notebook per country. It's really great for that. I think Netflix actually uses it in their ecosystem. So this is like probably half of what's in this class is done by Papermill, and others to catch a bunch of the edge cases that are available. So it's actually quite a lot of like getting rid of magic commands in notebooks and stuff. It's actually kind of complicated. I spent a lot of time on this and looking back at it. So how I use that is like in my unit tests, right? I like to have some of my unit tests just be notebooks. And if you've ever used this thing called Nbdev, it's made by FastAI. Their whole philosophy is that like you don't actually need to ever even write code in a Python file. You can just write all your code and your documentation and your examples and your unit tests all in a notebook, and have tools that like package it up for you. And it has the appeal of not having to like do things twice. Like if you spend time in notebooks doing prototyping, then you're basically one step away from having something that's already packaged, as opposed to saying, I've been doing stuff in notebooks. Now I'm gonna refactor and put this all into modules, and then I'm gonna write doc strings for all the modules and all the functions and so on. And it just kind of handles all that for you. And so I like to have a lot of documentation notebooks as well, or sorry, a lot of tests. So here, for example, I have tests, like for example, here's this backend test, right? So this is a notebook that gets, and see, I know GitHub, even after all this time, GitHub still has trouble rendering notebooks for some reason. See, like that's so ridiculous, right? Like I just can go to Nbviewer and get the same notebook, right? This works. Someone's making extension. I'll put a bounty on this. Someone who's making extension. It's just, if you have that extension, if you try to run a notebook on GitHub, it just goes to Nbviewer and puts an iframe there from Nbviewer, right? It wouldn't work on private repos, but it would work on everything else. So let's just do that real quick. If you ever know this trick, nbviewer.jupyter.org/GitHub. And there it is, right? There's the notebook. Okay, so here's me running basically writing unit tests in notebook. Hold on just a second, guys. I'll be right back. Yeah.
I wasn't aware of this rather neat trick of opening a notebook really quickly in Nbviewer, so I've learned at least one thing today. Okay, because we're not seeing more people joining in, I've changed the security settings to allow people to unmute themselves.
Sorry, guys. I got two kids out there running around. So like here is just a basically example of what could be a unit test, right? So this is importing some things, making some kind of dummy classes, trying some things, and raising exceptions if there's a problem, right? So if this gets executed and any exceptions are raised, in other words, if all the cells don't run from start to finish, that would be like a failed test. And so you can just use this rather than sort of, because I can write this sort of on the fly, and when I'm in a notebook, like prototyping it, and then I'm done, I can restart run, I'll make sure it runs. And then I want that to be my unit test. I don't want to go back and say, take this and I'll put it inside a unit test function, inside a unit test class, inside some new module, and have that be auto-discovered or whatever. I just want to run this, right? And so in order to do that, my code will, where were we here? It will take that and either run it directly or convert to a Python file, right? Either way, I mean, they're not completely equivalent, but they're almost equivalent. And the way that works is that in the unit test here, I can, let's see, I believe it's in Is it here or here? It's in here. Okay, these are all the modules. Yeah, these are all the modules, right? So in that case, it got converted to a notebook. But I have some cases in Neuron Unit where let's go to Neuron Unit. Actually, no, we don't have to do that. Here's the case, right? So here's one where I'm just saying run through all my notebooks, right? So this is coming from that notebook class that I was showing you before. It just does this. That's the test. Run chapter 1. Chapter 1 runs to completion. There's no assertion errors or anything. Then it works, right? And this one actually is trickier because it requires a new library that's technically not part of SciUnit. So I have it skipped for now. But if you have SymPy installed, or you install it at the time, it will run. So this is a way to use documentation as your tests, right? I mean, I think it's really powerful because you can always just find a way to get code coverage with, by writing some fake like test that makes a function call that's very unnatural. It just says like, oh, do this and convert this thing to this and blah blah blah. But that's not what your users are actually doing, right? Users are actually using your tool in real life. And so the notebooks, to the extent the notebook is like a demonstration of the thing you could really do, or many possible things you could really do, you just write a bunch of notebooks and you can I'll test all of those, right? And then that would be achieve the same code coverage as well, right? It might be in some ways be a little bit less transparent, but I think it's just much more natural. That's not to say that you shouldn't have like regular kinds of unit tests, like to catch all these like corner cases and things like that for functions you kind of understand. But I think having them like having the functions get called like in a natural way in like the normal flow of where a user would actually be and where the state of their like environment would be is like a powerful approach to like avoiding bugs. And also because of the notebooks, then this turns into this, right, which is my Jupyter book documentation. It's all the same notebooks, right? And I think a weakness of what I've done here is all of my notebooks, in a sense, are kind of the same thing. It's like a telescoping view of SciUnit, as opposed to being organized by like a topic, right? The topic could be, I talked about capabilities, right? I could have a notebook that's all about capabilities. I could have a notebook that's all about back-end caching, right? I don't have that. I just have like, here's a bunch of things you do in SciUnit, and here's a bunch of more things you do in SciUnit, and here's the same things you saw before, but in a slightly different context, right? Because that's how when I was writing these for other people, or when they're asking me questions, they kind of ended up in the documentation that way. I don't think it's like I don't think it's a bad way to learn, but I think it's not what people are expecting. If you look at the documentation for like PyTorch or something, it's not like this. It's written in a hierarchical, like categorical way that I'm currently not doing. And so I think I struggle to maybe like find the time or the energy to do that. And also it depends like, who's asking for it, right? I mean, no one ever told me that was a problem, but I'm just saying it's a problem, right? So if you notice that in this documentation, I think it's a problem. I have the API documentation separately, so I build the API documentation with Sphinx, with what's called Autodoc, Sphinx Autodoc, like everyone else does, I think. That's not this is the better one there. Right, we have this kind of style. I don't like that either. I actually think like I could click on this, right, and you could see, that's okay. And it has the doc strings, right? But I think it's still a little bit unnatural. And I'm thinking myself about moving to something more like Nbdev, where I'm building in the notebook from the start. And I know like maybe some of you guys hate Jupyter notebooks. I don't know. I mean, I know there's some developers who do, but I think it's a really powerful way to develop. So API documentation is all there. That's all built from read the docs every time there's a push, like I get most of you guys have in your products. Okay, what else is there? What else is there to talk about with you guys? None of the Docker stuff is interesting. GitHub is, sometimes GitHub badges are broken. GitHub recently had a problem where everything SciUnit depended on, or that depended on SciUnit was suddenly not listed. So my dependent repos were showing up as 0 for a while. but it's like 30 or something. And what else? What else? In terms of like how I think about the code and one more thing, serialization. So I think as we start to think about like shifting data, sending data to each other like over the internet, like not just like I emailed you a model file, but like here's the current state of something, and I would like my tool to give it to your tool. I think it's going to be a really important thing for us to all learn how to get good at. Here's an example, right? So I'm going to we have this this portal called SciDash, and it's not actually part of this talk, but I'm just gonna show a beta of it really quick. This is a place to store like test results, and we are if I go to, let's say here, you'll get a bunch of test scores that are things that were uploaded by people at different times, right? So this is like so and so did this test, and here's something about the test, the instance of the test that it came from. Here's something about the model. Here's the model's capabilities. Here's a bunch of parameters from the run. Here's a bunch of state variables from the run. Here is what simulator it used, and so on. And so here's the observations used, and so on, right? And if you want to, that's for individual test score. And if I go to whole test suites, right, I can get like these nice views, right, where I say, okay, here's 4 different model flavors. Here's 6 different tests, which here are stupid names. And here's like some test scores of each of them. And these are all normalized. So like 1 is like basically a perfect score. 1 is like you hit the bullseye on this test. The model output exactly matched this observation. And 0 would be like you're the farthest away you can from it. And given there's different kinds of test scores, different test score classes, there's a way in every test score that they get normalized between 0 and 1 for inter-score comparison, and that's what's being used in this visualization here. But I can hide some of these, and I can take a screenshot, or I can use this as a dashboard for this basically is the dashboard, right? It's like here's all the models I have in development, here's all the tests they're taking, here's how they're doing, here are their strengths and weaknesses, right? Which I think is like really powerful. But in order to do this, in order to send your information, you could test this on the server. Like there is an ability when you're a registered like member here to schedule tests here. I don't like it though, and I don't like it because I think that's like if you're sophisticated enough to be thinking about benchmarking your models, you're probably just going to go to a website to do it. You might go to a website to have a dashboard, but you're not going to probably go to a website to actually run anything. Or you're running stuff on your computer, on your server, on HPC, wherever you're running it, and then those results, in the same way that the results of a unit test, like Travis, go up into the cloud and get put on Travis, or your code coverage results go to coveralls or whatever. Your stuff should just, you run your stuff, and there's a post run hook or a commit hook that says send all these test scores out to SciDash, or maybe it's not even SciDash, maybe it's just like a widget running on your server or on GitHub with a badge that says here's how all your models are doing, here's the status, right? That's like the vision thing that I have. And in order to do that effectively, we need to be able to make sure that all of our outputs can be serialized and like sent to some server waiting to receive them. And sometimes we do that for some of what we have, but there's like some serializing things to be tricky. And if you know what I mean, what I'm talking about by serializing, do you guys know what I mean? I mean like turn something into a string and send it to the internet. Right, so I was serializing SciDash objects in a very ad hoc way, and I discovered there's this library called JSON Pickle, which is kind of a combination of JSON and Pickle, but better. And can serialize essentially everything. Like anything that, if you ever had something that couldn't be pickled or couldn't be, lots of things can't be turned into JSON by the default Python JSON library or other libraries, and lots of things can't be pickled, or they can be pickled, but then it's a pickle object. So what are you going to do with that? You have to have on the other end, there's to be a Python environment that's exactly the same, right, as your environment, more or less, to unpickle it. But if you have something that's JSON, now you have the string, and the string can be read by any tool. It includes tools that aren't in Python. It includes tools that are just going to do schema validation, for example, like with Cerberus, right? And it can check to make sure you have all the pieces you need and only read out the pieces that it needs, right? Because this is a JSON object, so this is a nested hierarchy of things. And so I've added, in the most recent version of SciUnit, which is not on pip yet, I've switched entirely to using JSON Pickle for all serialization of SciUnit objects. So SciUnit object could be quite complex, right? So if I have a matrix of scores, like you saw that matrix, that table that was up there, that matrix of scores is a subclass of the pandas data frame that has all the pandas things with it. That also has other attachments like the individual tests and individual models and individual scores. The scores have individual attributes like they or belong to a model or a test. They have raw data. They might have artifacts like a memory potential trace, right? It can get very nested. And when you serialize this, you may not want all of that stuff, but I think you want most of it. And so you have to have something that can serialize like arbitrary objects really well and turn them into a giant string. So JSON Pickle does that. So I have, here it is up. Wait, why is it not up there? Somewhere. Here it is. JSON Pickle. JSON Pickle also has the extensibility, right? So by default, JSON Pickle doesn't even serialize NumPy. Like it serializes things in a very funny way, which is that if something's already like a list or a dict or an int or whatever, it serializes it like to normal JSON just fine. If something's a more complex kind of object, it gives it a very, sometimes difficult to read but correct representation that can be deserialized back to the original object. But it also has these extensions that can help to serialize things in a more natural way. What these extensions do is they provide a method to serialize and deserialize objects that you can control that. You can extend those methods. And so I can add new handlers that can serialize like SciUnit objects better. And so I have in every SciUnit object has this base class that I'm showing you here. It's called SciUnit. This is the base class of almost all SciUnit objects. So it has a custom method for getting the state of the object, right? So normally get state would be like just calling like I think it just calls the dict attribute of the object. But in this case, maybe there's other things we want. For example, you have an object that has properties that are like the property decorator on a method, and you don't necessarily want those properties. Some of those properties you may want, some you might not. Like if I have a property that says like what is the hash of the object, right? And it calls a hashing function. That's not going to appear in dict because it's a property. So I want to like explicitly add the result of that property call to my state. So when I serialize it, I have that kind of information. I have this like, it's like essentially like called and acquired all the properties and pinned them as attributes to the state before it's serialized. And so what it does here is I have this JSON method, and this JSON method is on all SciUnit objects, and it has a few options. One of them is whether you want to be able to deserialize it later, which is something that makes it slightly more complex and take up more space, but is like obviously good if you ever want to actually do stuff with it on the other end of the internet. And basically what it does is something simple. It calls JSON-pickle.encode. This JSON-pickle.encode is using a SciUnit handler. So the SciUnit handler says, okay, anytime an object is the SciUnit instance, it's going to use this handler instead of the base handler. And this handler has these are like obligatory methods you have to implement in these handlers, flatten and you don't actually need restore, but you need flatten. And so what it does is I'm going to say, hey, after you get the state from get state, add the properties. So I can add things like hashes and other things, other properties of the object that otherwise wouldn't appear in the state. That way, when I get the thing that's pickled, I can look at that on the other end, the thing that's receiving serialization, and I can look at things like, oh, what was the model hash, and then check, did that model hash match something that's already in the database? And if not, store it. If not stored, if so, delete it or whatever. Also, there's just some other little details of JSON Pickle, but it's nice to be able to have a custom. I mean, JSON itself supports custom serializers, but the JSON Pickle ones are just better. They automatically handle certain like kind of recursion problems you might have. Like if you have object A has attribute B, B has attribute A, which refers back to A, right? Like you have like a circular dependencies in your attribute like chain. It handles those automatically, pretty elegantly. So that's nice, right? The normal JSON library doesn't do that. So I think it's really nice to be able to serialize objects because it enables like these like web tools that I think we want to make sometimes where we can take results of our models or results of our analyses and just stream them to someone else or to some other tool and have that tool deal with them. And that tool doesn't necessarily have to have all the libraries running, have to have the exact right version of the library, but that tool might just say, hey, I just want to extract like this element of this dictionary and this element of this dictionary, and then it's like print something on the screen, right? Like maybe that's all it needs to do, right? It doesn't need to reconstruct the entire object. And so serializing really helps, I think, for that.
Rick, just a question there. One trouble that I've always had pickling, let's say, the score object that SciUnit produces is when I'm running a neuron model.
Yeah, yeah.
So
You can't pick a hawk and stuff like that. Right?
Exactly. You always have that self.model and self.last
Yep.
model, which points to neuron segments.
So yeah, so pickle, that's the other thing about pickle. So in the current like pip release of SciUnit, there is an attribute called unpickleable, which there's some semantic confusion with that you'll see on the new version. But basically that attribute was saying that you could say, hey, when get state is called, because a pickle always calls get state to get the state of the object before it pickles it. You can exclude those objects. So anytime you implement get state in any class, you can always say, you can always, before you return this, you can delete the keys for things that can't be pickled. Then when pickle gets called, it won't see those keys and it won't try to pickle them. So that's the old way, and that's the way I had up until like a month ago or 2 months ago. And then I realized that JSON pickle actually can pickle like everything. Like it's no problem. Like it'll pickle a neuron object referring to a neuron object referring to a black hole at the center of the universe. I mean, it's like amazing, right? Like I can't believe it can pickle some stuff like that. I've never had it fail on anything unless I wrote a custom handler for it and I put a bug in the custom handler. I've never had it fail on a regular kind of object, which is sort of amazing. I'm sure there's something that failed on, but like it's pretty powerful. And so you can serialize a lot of stuff with it. Now, you don't necessarily want to serialize all the neuron stuff, like every single detail, right? And so whatever you have, you can still say in get state, exclude these things. And the way I do that now is rather than call it unpickleable, because that causes semantic confusion with a keyword argument called unpickleable in JSON pickle. Because my meaning of unpickleable meant it's impossible to pickle this thing, so don't try to pickle it. And their meaning of unpickleable is, do you want to be able to reverse pickling at the end? Right, which is totally not the same meaning at all. So what I have instead now is this thing called state hide. So in any class you make, you have a list called state hide. And state hide is any of these keys, any of these attributes should not be included in the state. So you see here, it's going to remove things. It's going to remove like dunder methods and things like that. And it's going to remove anything that's a method. You don't just serialize your methods unless they're properties. And anything in state hide, it's going to hide those things as well. And that this cool thing about the state hide is that I made this cool little thing called get list attribute with bases. So what this does is every base class, it will find this attribute base class. So normally, like if I call this, right, and then I say state hide equals in some subclasses, it just overwrites state hide. But what this does instead is it says every subclass, check every subclass for this, and add that to your list. And then make a set out of all those objects. So anything in any subclass or any superclass of the parent class that has state hide set, it's going to accumulate all those and it's going to exclude them from the state. So that way you can just say like, okay, I want to not have my .h, right? My .h attribute in there for any reason. Even if JSON pickle can pickle it, maybe it's just a waste of time, or maybe it makes the serialization be 100 times larger. You put that into state hide for your class, and it will hide that, and then it will make sure that it does not get included in the serialization, right? So in this case, I know things like this. I never need this in serialization. That's totally local. I don't actually want the hash still in the serialization. If you have the hash in the serialization and then it comes a new hash, that new hash will be different because it was looking at the old hash, and when that hash gets added, then you hash that, it's a different thing again. Even though the only thing that's changed is the actual hash value, so it hides the hash as well. But you can add anything you want there, and it will not serialize it. So that's all the cool like developer tricks that I have for this.
Sorry, yeah. No. I thought I just had a question regarding the simulation environment, but I'll wait for you to finish and then take it up at the end.
Oh, I was just gonna say I like type hints now too. I realized, especially actually for teaching, if you ever like students that are less experienced programmers, it's almost like when you see a stack trace and you see the bug and you say like, you can tell when it's a type error, right? Like not explicitly type error, but like you can tell when you made a typing mistake. When you accidentally, it's saying like, oh, like this object, it doesn't have an item or whatever. It doesn't have, you can't, you try to extract from a dictionary, from a list, you try to extract dot values or something like, and that's not a thing. It's only a thing in a dictionary. You can tell that, but a student can't always tell that right away. And they can be harder than that, right? They're harder typing errors to catch than that. And so by adding the type hints, and then every now and then running your code through MyPy, which you haven't used that, it's like this, it'll treat your code as if the type hints were static type enforcement. It will like make it a lot easier to catch those bugs before they arise, so that it's not necessarily impossible for a user to do it, because Python's still dynamically typed. If they're not running in MyPy, they can still make all those errors. But they can do it too. If they can't figure it out, they can run the same code they just ran and run it through MyPy. And instead of giving you scripting error, they'll be like, hey, you said this thing was a list and you passed it in a dictionary, or vice versa. And then they'll know that they made that mistake, right? So I think that's like, I've had some students catch errors like faster that way. And it's only asked them to add one like snippet of, it's only adding them to add like .mypy before they call their script or whatever. And then and if you haven't used I can't remember the name of the library. It's made by, I think it's made by Instagram, but it will like add, it will run your code through MyPy. It will figure out all the types, and then it will put in type annotations for you, and it will fill out document. Oh, and then there's another thing, it fills in documentation stubs. Like you literally can like almost statically type your whole code library without doing anything. I mean, you just fill in this stuff, you know, but it'll fill in like given you have your arguments already, it'll fill out all of this stuff, you know, and it'll fill out all of this stuff, this kind of stuff for you without you doing anything. And sometimes it's like wrong, or it has like a type that's like not, you might want to be more flexible that it's giving you there, and you can run through that. But I think it's really powerful, right? Because as our code gets complex, having things be dynamically typed is nice for being fast and prototyping, but it also can make our code buggy. So, and were we going to ask about simulation, Shailesh?
Right. Yep. So, by the way, the Instagram software that you're referring to, I think it's the one Monkey Type, right?
Monkey Type. That's it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I had a question regarding the simulation environment. So let's say you're running a particular test against a model. The result that you get can at times be, let's say, quite dependent on the simulation environment, the hardware architecture, and so on. So I was going to ask you, does SciUnit already have any ways of capturing this kind of information? And I saw on your SciDash entry, for example, I saw that I think Linux and the version was there, but probably not.
Yeah, so on SciDash, it captures some of this. It will call, I can't remember now if it's actually called when at the time of test execution or the time of test upload. But if you have like this here, okay, build info, right? This is not necessarily super, let's see here, what's actually in there, right? So that's not the most extensive build info, right? That's like that might not be the build info you want. The build info you want might be like, here's exactly my content environment down to like the last decimal point of every version of everything, right? And that, or here is like, I don't know, the whole history of my machine, or I ran out of this Docker environment or whatever. That's all stuff you can put in. There is, I believe, in the score instance, I believe there's something that produces this. I don't recall what it is now. But there's a few places that could occur. So one is in the actual so when you have score, you have score.models or score.model, and then model.something. That something is like, I believe is, or maybe it's in the test. I'll take it back to where the build info actually comes from. But it's basically just calling like import platform dot whatever, like stuff that gives you that information. But it could be anything you want. It could be any annotation you want. And also you can add arbitrary tags like SciDash if you wanted to do that. But it is not capturing like down to the last package at all, right? So like that's a mark against it in terms of reproducibility. That I think maybe something like well, looks like Sumatra had, right? And then the one you have now, I can't remember what it's called, but that I think you have better information about provenance that way.
So is that something that, let's say, is on the to-do list for the future? I mean, do you think
Yeah, so especially like, I mean, you guys have probably thought more about like what is the most concise summary of the environment, right? So one thing is like actually like environment hash. So I'd like to say like that if environment hash is the same and the model hash is the same, and test hash is the same, it literally cannot be any other thing but the same result, right? Like it has to be, unless there's a bug in your hardware, it should be the same result, right? So that's something that would be like a complete summary of like what the output actually is. But if if your NumPy version is different from mine, I mean, it's possible that like we get a different output. We hopefully we don't, but like it's possibly a different output, right? So that's something that, but I don't know in terms of like how you represent that. Like, what's the best way of representing your simulation environment? That you guys have thought about that more than I have, and so I'd like to, if you want that as a contribution, that I would be happy to like have a method in the score or the test that just or property. This is like a current environment, and it gives you a JSON dump or a dictionary of that information, and that can be included in the upload or whatever.
Yeah, like at the bare oh sorry, yeah, I was just saying at the bare minimum, I was wondering if it would be possible to sort of capture the dependency versions that are being used. So I mean, pip freeze basically just gives you everything that's there, which probably isn't ideal, but rather all the dependencies that get used during that execution.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, you're right. Pip freeze or whatever is like 8,000 things, right? So anything gets used would be everything that was imported at some point. So I think what you want to do is as soon as the I'm not sure how that would maybe you already solved this, right? But I'm not sure how that would be, because it even in the module that you're finally executing the final command, if you look at what's been imported into that module, it won't be everything that was imported to all the other modules, right? So I don't know how that is solved, but maybe you guys already if we solved that?
No, so we did try out Sumatra, ReproZip. So the thing is, all these tools have their, let's say, own pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
ReproZip, I think you sort of end up with a pretty large zip file, from what I remember, per simulation, which might not be, let's say, feasible for collecting a large number of validation results. So at the bare minimum, we were thinking of something like a Sumatra output, where at least you have the packages, the versions that were involved.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's still let's say, a pending task.
Thomas?
Well, yeah, if I can come in at this point, I'm just to throw a spanner in the works. Now, if you're using something that has concurrent execution, you're of course not guaranteed the same result, even with the exact same environment, the exact same versions, and so on and so on. You're just running it at different times. And there might be something else, like if you use a GPU and there's display on the same GPU, you get different results, right? If there's other computation going on the same GPU. And that's typically the case. In that case, you need to handle things differently. And I don't know how you see that, Richard, in terms of like your tolerances on test results. I mean, how is that the user's problem, or how do you see that?
I think so. I mean, so tolerances, like I have in Neuron Unit, I use some tests that run as part of a test suite, and I have like for bounds for those. So I know that certain tests on certain stock data sets should give a result that's like 0.7 or something. But I'd say the test passes if it's 0.68 and 0.72, because over time, as I run these and I put on Travis, and Travis did a new version of NumPy and a new version of SciPy, and the results would change a little bit, and you couldn't have an exact number. And but if there was ever a big jump, like it went from 0.7 to 0.8, that was like my code, my bug usually. Like there was some other problem that had been fixed, right? So I don't know if I should. I don't know how much I should care, like like sometimes we just like pass fail for a test, right? Or we just like an approximate score. We're gonna look at the leaderboard. We're kind of like glaze our eyes and just look for the patterns, right? And not the exact number. So I don't know for me personally if I care about the exact number, but if someone else does, then we want to make sure that that's frozen, right? That there's a way to really truly reproduce that exact thing.
And the way it's expressed in SciUnit is with the tolerance interval. Yeah, that's the.
Yeah. So for example, for like there's different kinds of test classes, but for the Boolean or score classes, for the Boolean score, you say it passes if, and then and then you give a range, for example. So there's this converter functions that say like, okay, let's say your test is going to be a z-score test of the model against some distribution of the data, and you might say pass if z is within plus or minus 2, right? That could be like an interval, right? And then so that's the passing, right? And I mean, honestly, if you can actually achieve that on every single stylized fact about the simulated system you're trying to simulate, you've been pretty successful, right? Without, you don't have to get exactly, a particular number.
Yes, yeah, but each user needs to figure out what they actually want, right? You can't take it for them.
It's left to them, right? So all the like in SciUnit, I didn't go over this, but in SciUnit, in the obligatory sections of a test you have to fill out are generate prediction and compute score. Generate prediction is what is it that what methods this test requires certain capabilities. What methods is it going to call on the model to get out the thing the model produces, right? So that's up to the person writing the test. And then the compute score, there are basically, again, this is up to the user, right? When they write the test, they might want to do it one way, they might want to do it another way. We give them a bunch of utilities to do that, and a bunch of ways to convert between score types and some automatic tools that they can use if they want, but that's really up to them. So
thanks.
I have a rather general question. How many of your tools in general, this is not just for Richard, are you folks still supporting Python 2, or has everybody officially dropped support for Python 2?
I gave up on Python 2 of same time. Well, I actually posted a poll on Twitter like 3 years ago saying, hey, can I drop Python 2 yet? Is it okay? And enough people said no that I said okay. But then I said, okay, but like I think NumPy dropped it on like January 1st, 2020 or something. So when that was approaching, I said, if NumPy's gonna drop Python 2, I'm gonna drop Python 2. This is, I mean, I shouldn't have to deal with this anymore. So I did. In fact, I don't even support anything below Python 3.5, I think. Because if you're using Python 3, why would you be using Python 3.3? Like, who would be doing that? So
yeah. So I mean, I always end up using, so I'm on Python 3.9 now.
Yeah. 6
months time, I'll be on 3.10 because Fedora always sticks to the latest Python version. So we're running we're running everything to 3.10 already, and I've been filing bugs left, right, and center.
Wow. I'm using 3.9 mostly, but 3.9 doesn't, AWS doesn't support 3.9 yet, or AWS Lambda doesn't support 3.9. So if I want to deploy certain kinds of like micro apps, I should go back to 3.8 for those. And this is a pain. So
yeah, I think our primary issue is that there's so many NeuroML repositories that, well, they're years and years old, and they've all been written in Python 2. And completely dropping Python 2 support means somebody, which will be pouring in me, will have to spend hours and hours updating all of that code to Python 3.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that the trade-off, right, is that like someone's have to spend hours doing something. It's either spending hours making everything support Python 2, or spending hours converting Python 2 to Python 3. And I think the balance is just flipped to like, I mean, how much? So 2 to 3 will do some of the work for you, right? And then the rest will be by hand, I guess.
Yeah, because when you mentioned typing, so I added a few pull requests to PyNeuroML and all that, and I wanted to use typing. But because Python 2 doesn't support this form of type annotations, I had to strip all of them out and rewrite them as the old annotations where you go hash annotation after the function definition.
Yeah.
So, and that's when I realized, so I've already opened a ticket saying we need to plan to drop Python 2. But yeah, I think the amount of work it'll take to update all of those models, because it'll break open source brain version 1, right? All of these models have to keep working on OSBB 1. So until we have that in the pipeline, I think we may not be able to drop it. But yeah, but I need to keep pestering Porrick to do it.
Well, I mean, the number of Python 2 users. I mean, the only Python 2 user. So when you say it doesn't work, you don't mean that there's two parts, right? One is putting Python 3 stuff into it, like type annotations, and the other is just having it actually work on Python 3.
Yeah.
And I mean, the first thing is maybe easier, because if everything works on Python 3, then you can tell any user use Python 3. And honestly, I mean, who's not using Python 3? I mean, it's, you know what I mean? Like you might be using Python 2 for some legacy reason, like I need to support this thing. But it's not like your default thing. If you're going to install Python, is to install Python 2 just because you like it.
No, yeah. I think the primary reason is somebody wrote a model 4 years ago and are still using that model, and it was written in Python 2. And academics do not like updating their environments unless absolutely necessary. So if it will still work on Mac or Linux or whatever they're using, they will not touch it, right? And that makes it, that makes it a bit dicey. But at some point it has to be done. I mean, if it's not officially supported, then then there's only so much we can do to keep tagging it along.
Maybe what I wonder if like Chen Zuckerberg or something, and these like software grants would be like, you said, we need to convert a bunch of stuff from Python 2 to Python 3, or neuroscience will die forever. And then that's your pitch, right? And maybe and it's not glorious work, right? But it's like it would give you $1,000 just to do that for all the models.
Yeah, we'll have to find a way, because it's getting, as you said, it's getting harder and harder to make sure code remains compatible with Python 2. There's so many features of Python 3 I would like to use that you can't, because it needs to be compatible with Python 2. That's far from ideal. Yeah.
But then when you said earlier that scientists don't like to update their environment, if they don't, then they don't run into problems, right? Because they don't update their NeurML stuff neither. So I mean, the old stuff still continues to run with Python 2. It's just the new stuff that doesn't.
Well, there'll be bug fixes, right? And so on. And then,
who for scientific packages actually does bug fixes for old versions only, right? We always introduce new features at the same time. No one does just a bug fix branch of the old version. I mean, we did it for a short while, due also to the Python 2.3 transition. But I mean, we don't have the resources in general, I guess.
No, it's just legacy code that needs to be updated, and like everything else, we're quite scared of touching it to that extent.
But I mean, as Richard said, I think for many projects, the tipping point was really NumPy, Matplotlib, and so on. They're Python 3 only, and now it's. I mean, when people complain that something is not working, it's I'm sorry, NumPy or Matplotlib, the newest version doesn't. And I mean, then blame them, not us. We are just following them or something. I mean, they shouldn't blame them, of course. I mean, it kind of takes the burden away from you, as you are not the only one not supporting Python.
That's very true.
It's like the majority of packages not supporting Python 2 anymore.
I mean, I know that they were concurrent, right? So it's not enough to say Python 3 came out in 2009 or whatever it came out, right? But I think that the 2.7 came out a long time ago, right? So like and basically everything is just bug fixes of 2.7 more or less. So I don't know. I'm happy to. You have my blessing. I'm all by that. I couldn't stand it anymore. I was like, I'm tired of writing, all these extra things to support Python 2, and not having my type annotations work. That was my last straw.
No, I totally agree. I just need to wear Porrick down.
Joe, you have any questions? Evan, you haven't asked me a question in 20 some years, so.
Nope.
I met Joe 23 years ago, 24 years ago. We both grew up in Arizona, and then we didn't see each other again for a long time.
Now, hopefully, well, I'm rather optimistic, but hopefully next year CNS will go ahead in Leipzig, hopefully. And
That'd be
we'll
nice.
be able to get back to physical meetings. But yeah.
That's awesome. Anything else to discuss?
Not from me. I thought that was really great. We're going to have the recordings put up, and I tend to go over recordings again and make notes and see what I missed the first time. So yeah, that'll work really well for me.
I'm always super into just learning about tools that I didn't know about, and so I'd like to watch these as well, and let me know if you find any other things up my alley.
Well,
And SciUnit, just because I'm like I wrote most of the code doesn't mean I don't want to help. I don't want contributors, right? So if you are a user or have something interesting to want to do with it, or direction you want to take it in, please let me know, and we'll welcome that.
sounds great. I think most people here have something or the other at CNS, so all our tools will get a bit of exposure there. And I think everybody will, in Europe at least, will go on holiday after CNS. So we might wait until people get back to continue with further dev sessions, because Joe's got one lined up for NetPine that will be very, very interesting. And I've got to hound a few other people to do more dev sessions. But I think we might wait until late August, early September to continue those.
I have a Google Summer Code student that's starting now, basically, to do some NetPine SciUnit stuff. So I will, when we are a little further on that, Joe, I'll let you know. Salvador knows about it, but I'm gonna sort of show you what we've come up with, and we can figure out.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sounds great.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk, Richard. That was really interesting.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. If nothing else, we end the meeting and everybody goes back to doing whatever they were doing.
Cheers, Shai.
Thanks very much.
everyone.
See you
See you guys.
later. Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye bye.